October 24, 1907. A cold autumn wind swept through the canyon of Wall Street, but the chill felt by the thousands of people crowding the pavement had nothing to do with the weather. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a desperate surging mass pressing against the heavy bronze doors of the city's most prestigious financial institutions. These were not seasoned speculators, but ordinary citizens, business owners, and clerks, all united by a sudden, primal terror. They had come to withdraw their life savings, driven by rumors that the vaults were empty. This was not merely a localized fright, but the onset of a catastrophic financial collapse that threatened to drag the entire American economy into ruin. At the dawn of the 20th century, the United States operated under a banking system that was fundamentally fractured and dangerously brittle. There was no central authority, no national lender of last resort, and no deposit insurance to guarantee the money held by everyday depositors. Capital flowed freely, driven by the unchecked ambitions of the Gilded Age, but it possessed no safety valve. When localized shocks struck the system, the resulting tremor could easily trigger a cascading failure. Banks relied entirely on their own reserves and the fragile web of mutual trust. Once that trust evaporated, the math of fractional reserve banking guaranteed disaster. The spark that ignited this tinderbox was struck by a man named F. Augustus Heinze. A brazen copper magnate, Heinze orchestrated a highly leveraged scheme to corner the stock of the United Copper Company. He believed he could trap short sellers and force them to buy back shares at exorbitant prices, utilizing a labyrinth of loans secured from various New York financial institutions. Heinze executed his maneuver in mid-October, driving the stock price up with artificial force. But the trap failed. The short sellers did not capitulate, and the stock price of United Copper plummeted from $62 to just $15 in a matter of hours. The collapse of Heinze's scheme immediately exposed the hidden rot beneath the surface of Wall Street. The banks and trust companies that had financed his reckless gamble were suddenly holding millions in worthless collateral. Panic is a highly contagious pathogen in financial markets, and the infection spread with terrifying speed. Depositors, realizing the interconnected nature of these loans, began to question the solvency of any institution even remotely associated with the copper magnate. The focus of the mob quickly shifted to the trust companies, a relatively new breed of financial entity that operated with fewer regulatory constraints and significantly lower cash reserves than traditional national banks. The eye of the storm settled on the Knickerbocker Trust Company, the third largest trust in New York City. Rumors of its insolvency swept through the metropolis, prompting a devastating bank run. By October 22nd, the line of terrified depositors stretched for blocks outside its opulent Fifth Avenue headquarters. Tellers scrambled to pay out towering stacks of cash, but the outflow was unsustainable. Within hours, the Knickerbocker had bled $8 million and was forced to bolt its doors, suspending operations indefinitely. The suspension sent a shockwave across the country. If a titan like the Knickerbocker could fall in a single afternoon, no bank was safe. With the federal government lacking the legal mechanisms and financial firepower to intervene, the survival of the American economy rested on the shoulders of private individuals. Enter J.P. Morgan. At 70 years old, the formidable financier was semi-retired, attending an Episcopal convention in Virginia when the crisis erupted. Summoned back to New York by frantic telegrams, Morgan arrived to find a financial district paralyzed by fear. He did not hold public office, nor was he an elected official, but his immense wealth, unparalleled network, and sheer force of will made him the de facto central bank of the United States. Morgan understood that the panic of 1907 was not just a crisis of capital, but a crisis of psychology. To stop the contagion, he needed to construct a firewall of undeniable financial strength. He established a command center in the newly built library of his Madison Avenue mansion. Surrounded by priceless, illuminated manuscripts and Renaissance art, Morgan began summoning the city's most powerful bankers, trust presidents, and government officials. He demanded absolute transparency, deploying teams of young auditors to examine the ledgers of teetering institutions to determine which could be saved and which had to be left to die. The immediate danger shifted to the Trust Company of America. Morgan's auditors determined that the institution was fundamentally solvent but suffering from an acute liquidity crisis. It had the assets, but it lacked the immediate cash to satisfy the panicked mob at its doors. Morgan knew that if this trust fell, the domino effect would obliterate the remaining financial institutions in the city. He famously declared that this was the place to stop the bleeding. Working with his syndicates, he pledged millions of his own money and strong-armed other bankers into matching his contributions, physically shuttling bags of gold and currency to the beleaguered trust just as its vaults were running dry. Despite this massive infusion of capital, the psychological grip of the crisis remained unbroken. The stock market began to seize up. On October 24th, the president of the New York Stock Exchange arrived at Morgan's library with a grim pronouncement. Brokerage houses were collapsing, and unless $25 million could be raised immediately, the exchange would be forced to close its doors early, an unprecedented event that would signal total economic surrender. The destruction of wealth would be catastrophic, rippling out from the trading floor to factories, farms, and households across the nation. Time was running out. In a matter of minutes, Morgan summoned the presidents of the city's major commercial banks to his office. He did not ask for their assistance. He demanded it. He informed them that they had 10 minutes to pledge the necessary $25 million to keep the exchange open. The sheer gravity of his presence, coupled with the existential threat facing their own institutions, broke their resistance. The funds were pledged, the money reached the exchange floor just before the closing bell, and a total market collapse was narrowly averted. Yet the echoes of that panic still resonated. The crisis possessed a hydra-like quality. Severing one head only caused another to spring forth. A few days later, a massive brokerage firm, Moore & Schley, found itself on the brink of bankruptcy. The firm held $30 million in loans secured by the stock of the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company. If the brokerage failed, the collateral would be dumped onto the open market, triggering a fresh wave of panic and destroying the fragile stability Morgan had just engineered. The solution required a maneuver of astonishing audacity. Morgan orchestrated a buyout. He proposed that his own creation, the United States Steel Corporation, acquire the struggling Tennessee Coal Company. This would replace the precarious collateral held by the banks with highly liquid gold standard bonds of U.S. Steel. However, this corporate absorption raised immediate antitrust concerns. President Theodore Roosevelt, a known crusader against corporate monopolies, had to be convinced to allow the merger to proceed. Morgan dispatched emissaries on an overnight train to Washington to secure the president's blessing before the markets opened on Monday morning. Back in New York, Morgan played his final, most dramatic card. On the night of November 2nd, he gathered the city's top trust company presidents in his library. These men had previously refused to contribute to the broader rescue efforts, preferring to hoard their own reserves. Morgan locked the heavy brass doors of the library and pocketed the key. He presented them with a document pledging $25 million to save the weaker trusts, and he simply refused to let them leave until they signed it. As dawn broke, exhausted and cornered, the bankers capitulated. The signature of each man was secured, and the doors were finally unlocked. The sheer force of Morgan's intervention finally broke the fever. The lines outside the banks began to dissipate, and the hoarding of cash slowly ceased. The immediate threat of total financial annihilation had passed, but the cost was staggering. The panic triggered a severe economic contraction. Industrial production plummeted, bankruptcies soared, and thousands of Americans lost their jobs. The structural weaknesses of the Gilded Age economy had been laid bare for the entire world to see, revealing a terrifying truth about the nation's prosperity. The realization that the survival of the American economy had depended entirely on the wealth and willpower of one 70-year-old private citizen sent shockwaves through Washington. It was a profound vulnerability. Morgan's actions were heroic, but they were not a sustainable system of governance. If he had been out of the country or simply unwilling to act, the nation would have plunged into a depression of unimaginable depth. The public and political outcry demanded a permanent structural solution to prevent such a crisis from ever happening again. This awakening catalyzed a fundamental shift in American financial philosophy. In 1908, Congress passed the Aldrich-Vreeland Act, which established the National Monetary Commission to study the banking systems of Europe and propose a blueprint for reform. The era of decentralized, fragmented banking was drawing to a close. The unseen forces of speculation, however, continued to churn beneath the surface, necessitating an institution capable of managing the money supply and acting as a definitive lender of last resort. The blueprint for this new institution was drafted in absolute secrecy. In November 1910, a group of elite bankers and politicians, including Senator Nelson Aldrich, boarded a private train car under the guise of a duck hunting trip. Their destination was Jekyll Island, a remote, exclusive resort off the coast of Georgia. For over a week, operating under assumed first names to avoid the press, these men debated, negotiated, and ultimately drafted the foundational structure of what would become the nation's central banking apparatus. The legislation born from that secretive gathering faced years of intense political debate, reflecting deep-seated American anxieties about centralized financial power. But the memory of the terrifying days of 1907 provided the necessary political momentum. On December 23, 1913, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law. This landmark legislation created a decentralized central bank, a network of regional reserve banks overseen by a board in Washington, designed to provide an elastic currency and a permanent backstop against systemic collapse. The creation of the Federal Reserve fundamentally altered the trajectory of American history. It marked the end of the era of private financial titans acting as sovereign saviors. The responsibility for maintaining economic stability was permanently transferred from the wood-paneled libraries of Wall Street billionaires to the halls of federal power. Yet the new system was not a panacea. The complex mechanisms of the Federal Reserve would be tested, and sometimes fail, in the decades to come, proving that the human propensity for panic and speculation is an enduring force. The legacy of that autumn crisis extends far beyond the creation of a central bank. It stands as a profound testament to the fragility of trust, the invisible currency upon which all financial systems operate. When that trust shatters, the descent into chaos is swift and merciless. The events of 1907 remain a pivotal case study in the architecture of disaster, a stark reminder that beneath the complex mathematics of modern finance lies the unpredictable beating heart of human psychology.